Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with my early midfielders and forwards tier list. This is part of a two-part series. I actually covered the goalkeepers and defenders, and also my thoughts on game weeks 1 to 8 and the fixture difficulty of all the teams in FPL so far. So please click in the exclamation mark above if you'd like to actually watch that video just before you head into this, so you kind of understand my thoughts on how I feel about midfielder pricing and forward pricing. This is less so, I would say, players that you'd like to focus on if you're going for an aggressive wild card, but more so just thinking about how efficient players are in terms of their pricing, whether some new players or some players who didn't play very much last season will actually have a chance to probably feature as top options, such as you can see, players like Wilson and Bailey are in this list. Harry Wilson coming from a championship team, and Bailey, someone who was injured for the most part of last year, but looked quite good in the preseason so far. But if we start with the S tier, we actually have someone like Bowen at the top. Bowen was West Ham's talisman pretty much after that really hot streak from Benrahma and Antonio with the first 4 game weeks, and since then he's been fantastic. He was kind of underlooked as well at the end of the last season when he was consistently scoring braces and also creating creative masterclasses as West Ham's key player. And the issue with Bowen, of course, is he's at that 8.5 price, which locks you out of players like Mount and Maddison. And even if you go for Luis Diaz, right, and opt for Luis Diaz over a Robertson, it's really hard to move into Bowen. And his first week 1 game is going to be versus Man City. So it seems like it's going to be a player that will miss. I think Bowen is actually still well priced. You can actually see in column 5 here, 21-22 points per match divided by price for the current season. You can still see he actually rates really well, even with the kind of 8.5 price being contextualized here. So he is still an extremely efficient player, and if he maintains his output from the previous season, he clearly is going to be a top option. The same goes for Mount and Maddison, who are just below him in that kind of efficiency metric, and they're just a bit cheaper, so it might call into question the fixtures. Mount has better fixtures, but I would say this Chelsea team does look like a little bit of a mess right now. They haven't really hit any preseason form, and they're also going through a bit of a squad upheaval. You still have players who are on their way out of the club, seemingly, with players like Azpilicueta, maybe even Alonso. Even in the attacking positions, you have players like Pulisic and Ziyech who aren't necessarily preferred by the manager. Then you have these kind of long-term rumors with Jorginho wanting to go back to Italy. But still, there's a little bit of kind of disorganization, I would say, with this Chelsea team, and they don't look like a well-oiled unit, whereas Leicester did look pretty much like a well-oiled unit towards the end of the season. They did have very, very easy games, I would say, in comparison, and that's probably one thing that I would say that Leicester do not have at the start of this season, which is why maybe Maddison will actually find his way out of most people's drafts. Maddison should end up being an option that we look at later in the season, potentially, when Leicester's games are slightly eased up. I know some people are still going for Vardy and Maddison, and I think generally it could be a good gamble, but I would say Leicester were still, for the most part, worse than some teams like Arsenal, and definitely were not able to kind of control games versus some of the top opposition, such as Tottenham as well. So that's kind of my concern with their tough fixtures at the start. Whereas with Chelsea, arguably their toughest match is going to be versus Tottenham, but we know they have been, in a sense, Tottenham's bogey team for a while. So I'm feeling a little bit more confident about Mount to start the season with. As far as Son, Salah, and De Bruyne, this is a very interesting dynamic because you also have the 2 premiums from Kane and Haaland as well, saving you 0.5 million off of De Bruyne and Son. And with Salah, it seems like either you go for a draft that just operates around Salah and then a mix of Kane or Haaland, which is the template right now, or you can actually go for a pure Salah draft or a draft that goes Salah-less because it does save you 1 million. I would say it probably makes a lot more sense to go with Salah. I think that there's nothing for me to point it out that says he will kind of fall off in terms of his consistency year on year. He's been a lethal threat, and he's a fantastic captaincy option for pretty much game weeks 1 to 8. There's no reason to kind of move off of him. Even the United fixture, I would say, is arguably one where you'd like to captain Salah. I'm not so fond of the kind of Salah-less premium drafts, or rather the 1 premium drafts with Salah. I still think it makes a lot of sense to go with the double premium. It makes the most sense. The 3 premiums, I think, are just inefficient, to be honest, and just not worth it. Ultimately, you only have 1 captaincy option per week. You don't really need 3 of them to pick between, in my opinion, and that's kind of what it's come down to with City and Liverpool being such dominant teams, and even a team like Spurs being capable of upsetting teams like City, which is one of their only tough games within game weeks 1 to 8, amongst the kind of Chelsea game as well, which will be a little bit tougher, but you kind of have Salah there as your security. I would actually say I'm probably leaning more towards Son if we're talking pure midfielders. Watching the Bayern game yesterday, I would say De Bruyne clearly plays in a much more advanced position when Haaland's not on the field. And when Haaland is on the field, he gets to drop a little bit deeper into the midfield and get much more touches in the system, which will probably lead to him getting more of the kind of passes that will give him the assist before the assist, as opposed to the player who is consistently kind of scoring braces or even capable of scoring pokers, such as for Wolves. And I think that's the one concern with De Bruyne But I think we shouldn't really sleep on De Bruyne. He could be a fantastic option, especially if you're, let's say, concerned with Haaland and his injury record, his ability to actually stay fit week on week. That will actually call into question whether you want to go Haaland at all. And maybe if you're not really fond of Spurs and you don't really like the Chelsea game, the City game that they have between game weeks 1 to 8, maybe De Bruyne is actually the better option for you. But I would say right now De Bruyne is probably the least favorite of my options out of all the teams, because I would say when Haaland is playing, and I would expect him to play, he probably creates the absolute least in comparison to, let's say, someone like Kane, who also drops deep but does also find his way forwards to kind of score at times. And I think Haaland will be that person occupying spaces in the box, and therefore that kind of does shut out De Bruyne a little bit. Sancho and Saka are fantastic options as well at that 7.5 to 8 price range. Saka's obviously competing with Jesus, and I'll discuss Jesus in the forward portion as well. But Saka's interesting because I think he's the player who's probably the most nailed in Arsenal. We know towards the end of last season he was playing consistently 90 minutes. The Arsenal fixture swing is fantastic, but I think what Saka is dealing with as well is potentially the threat of Martinelli being a 6.0 priced midfielder. And on top of that as well, maybe the threat of Jesus taking penalties. Jesus hasn't necessarily been a great penalty taker in the past, but I do actually think he will take penalties. That's kind of my assumption here. But I would still class Saka as a top option. Once again, it's ultimately about your flexibility. Do you want to go for a 4-4-2 to start with, or a 4-5-1? It seems like Jesus is nice because he gives you that flexibility to be your second striker. There aren't too many options, I guess, to really go alongside a Haaland or a Kane if you are opting for those players. And I think Jesus just makes the most sense, unless you want to go for sleeper picks such as Martial, or even go a little bit outside the box by going for a championship kind of promotion kind of candidate, or someone like Tony or Wilson, that being Callum Wilson from Newcastle. So that's kind of what we're dealing with right now. I would say Neto is a fantastic option at 5.5. What I like about him and why I've priced him here in this bracket as an S tier player is because I know he will be nailed compared to someone like Rashford or Martinelli, where I would say I'm a little bit more cautiously optimistic about how many minutes they'll get at the start of the season. What we know with Man United is that they have the opportunity with 5 subs to actually rotate quite a bit. If, let's say, Rashford has a bad game, he's more likely to be prone to being subbed off at 60, 65 minutes. And the same goes with Martinelli, whereas with Neto, I would actually expect him to play 90 minutes consistently, which is actually why I think he's outrageously well priced at 5.5. And yes, he didn't have a great season last year. That's why you can see that efficiency metric doesn't really correlate to him being a good player, at least not nowhere near the S tier. But and the same goes with Sancho, really, who actually did play much more games. But the difference with Neto, of course, we have seen previously him performing very well. He's a very, very direct player and probably one of the more lethal, I would say, players in that team. Podence is someone who creates a lot, but I would say isn't very clinical as a finisher, whereas I would say Neto is very direct and very clinical as a finisher, and that's for me the eye test for Neto as to why he's quite interesting, given that Wolves have some nice games to start off with. Going to Sancho as that kind of last player to round out things, I would say he's the most consistent player United had in the previous season. That's not really saying much because they had a very, very terrible year, but in the preseason, I think that kind of vein has continued as well. Martial has been one of the surprise performers, but Sancho's consistency, I would say, and him kind of getting through that rookie season out of the way with United leaves me to thinking that he could probably step up once again and be that talisman for this United team alongside probably Fernandes, to be quite honest. And I would say, yeah, his style of play definitely fits with Ten Hag. He is very creative, very flexible. His ability to kind of switch the flanks and also play on both flanks as a very dual-footed player is quite interesting. And I really like Sancho and his creative abilities as well. He did score quite a few goals last season, probably the second most interesting player outside of Ronaldo from the attacking point of view. And I think if you're expecting United to kick on this season, Sancho's probably the most interesting player to think about because he's, I would say, probably least prone to rotation outside of, let's say, if Ronaldo was able to join the team, or Fernandes, who's a little bit too overpriced for me. If we go into the A tier now, this is kind of the half portion of the A tier. We have players like Wilson. I would say Wilson actually is an interesting prospect. I've put him here because he had such a great championship season. We know he's very lethal in a very similar vein to someone like James Ward-Prowse, right? Someone who's very, very good at free kicks, can take set pieces, can probably actually contribute in many ways, as many ways as possible for this Fulham team if they were actually able to perform well at all. The early season run isn't too bad for Fulham. Ultimately, we do expect them to be potentially relegation candidates, and that's probably where Wilson falters. Bailey's a fantastic pick right next to him. I think Bailey's probably the most interesting player for most FPL assets and owners because he's so close to that 4.5 price. He gives you that kind of cost cut that players like Martinelli and Rashford don't afford you, even though they're considered budget players. And I think Bailey being at 5.0 is a ridiculously good pricing. We do just need a little bit more sample size, right? He is competing for that spot with around 6 players in that Aston Villa team, and ultimately 3 to 4 of those players will be playing at one time the pitch. You have 5 subs as well, so that kind of does hamper Bailey's prospects of playing consistently. And then we also don't have any guarantees on his actual fitness because he's come back from injury, and it might take a little bit of time for him to actually play consistently in terms of having the big minutes. And that's kind of the big problem, I would say, with a lot of these players in this A tier list, where if they're not key players for their team, they are very rotatable. Same goes with Benrahma, who is actually struggling to kind of displace Lanzini from the team. He was someone who did start the season off hot previously. Hasn't really shown that sort of promise in the preseason so far, but I know Benrahma is a young player, and he's someone that we do expect to actually improve continuously, whereas the player kind of competing with his spot the most is Lanzini, who is slightly getting on with age and someone you expect to play less and less in the future. So I'd say Benrahma is someone who, in my opinion, is actually really well priced. If you look at the efficiency metric, he does rank actually the highest here in this list of top tier players, and that's kind of interesting. It does kind of tell you that Benrahma is well priced. So maybe later in the season, when West Ham have a cleaner kind of run of games and a better fixture schedule, I would say Benrahma is definitely a player to think about. Kulusevski has been dropped into the A tier. He's definitely a player who was extremely exciting when he joined Spurs, and as you all know, if you were watching me in the previous season, I was super high on Kulusevski from the start. The issue, of course, is Richarlison and the rotation. And even in the previous year, we saw some games where Kulusevski wasn't starting consistently. There were some games where Lucas Moura was starting ahead of him. It did seem like he had some stamina issues that hopefully I think would have been ironed out. But I think, yeah, the problem with Richarlison is he does provide a huge looming threat over Kulusevski's minutes. And therefore, I think he's very different into players in comparison to players like Mount, Maddison, Sancho, and Saka, in that I think he's much more prone to rotation. Bruno Guimaraes is a player that I've kept here. I mean, I don't really expect him to do tremendously well in FPL this season as a midfielder in comparison to most. He is ultimately a box-to-box midfielder, someone who's very creative, very technical, and also has a little bit of goal-scoring threat. But I just think he's not that explosive of an option. I think he's someone that I think people might have been very high on just because he performed so well near the back half of last season. And that's a little bit of FOMO, I think, from most managers. I don't really think he's a Cree option, but I've kept him here in the A tier. If you were thinking of an asset at 6.0, I just think that there are better options right now being presented to us, especially, for example, Martinelli, who you'll actually see in part 2 of the midfielders tier list. What I would actually say is that Martinelli is at a fantastic price for me in comparison to someone like Odegaard, who I've actually discounted and I put him in the C tier. I just don't really think there's a world where I'd like to go Odegaard, even though he is much more nailed from a minutes point of view than Martinelli. Yes, he did score a goal versus Chelsea, which was actually assisted by Martinelli. But if you look at the game and you look at the highlights and just the way Arsenal play in general, even going back to last season, you will see that Martinelli does find himself in a lot of great shooting positions. He's able to cut inside and actually take a shot with his right foot. He's also very creative in the sense that he can actually drive against defenders and then actually look for a cutback pass, or just like, for example, when he provided the assist for Odegaard, just slip through a great through ball between the defense. And he also does take some set pieces at times. So that's kind of a big buff to what Martinelli presents as a player. And with Smith Rowe potentially dealing with some injuries at the start of the season, I do think Martinelli could be a player we could consider as an S tier option. I just think that there is a bit of risk that, especially with the 2 to 3 weeks we have left, you have Smith Rowe maybe being able to recover, and then Martinelli being just super prone to being rotated. I just think there's much more security overall in going for Jesus and Saka if you want to go for that one Arsenal attacking option. If you want to double up, I do think Martinelli makes a lot of sense there. And if you have the kind of space to allow him to go in your squad, then go for Martinelli. Coutinho is an interesting one because Aston Villa do have a lot of great, lovely games to start off with. He is at that weird price where he's just between these kind of top tier options at the 8.0 price, and then some of the cheaper options that we've discussed, you know, amongst players like Neto and Martinelli. And I think that's kind of why Coutinho is at a crossroads for me. I think if you want to target Aston Villa, you could go for players like Dean or Cash. These are fullbacks who do contribute a lot to attacking play, and I think Coutinho has dropped off a little bit in terms of his ability to actually control games and actually really destroy some of the opposing teams, and that's kind of what concerns me overall with Coutinho, his ability to actually stay on the field for 90 minutes. Now that you have options like Leon Bailey even coming back from injury, and then Buendia also waiting in the wings, I just don't really think it makes a lot of sense to go for Coutinho. I think it's just too much rotation to deal with, whereas arguably a player like Watkins at 7.5 probably doesn't have to deal with that much rotation because there isn't too much of a replacement for Watkins as a player. As far as Foden, I think he's at a very good price. The only issue, of course, is that he has missed the preseason for Man City. And I would also say that from an efficiency metric, he played a lot of minutes last year, and I don't think he really shown as much as we expected. He is a player that I would say contributes a lot to footballing from the Man City point of view. But in terms of FPL, I don't think he's the best asset overall. We have seen explosive games from Foden. He is a player that does take set pieces at times when Kevin De Bruyne doesn't take them. But I just think that when it comes down to actually getting goals and assists. He's not that player who's super hungry to do that. He does a lot of nice plays. He's able to kind of break down defenses, and I think he provides a lot from that sense to the team. And at an 8.0 price, I do think he's like slightly expensive compared to some of the other options who are more so talismans for their teams, being Mount and Saka and options such as those. Sterling for me as well is at an expensive price. I just think this Chelsea team is really struggling to actually find what their ideal attacking formation would be, and I think Tuchel ultimately is still very unhappy with the depth. You had Lukaku, who was very ineffective last season. He's moved on now, but there hasn't really been a replacement, I would say, that has come into this Chelsea team that I would say would propel this attack forwards. A lot of the attack was created through their ability to score goals and also keep clean sheets as well. They weren't a team that really were exploding against teams, unless it was against teams like Norwich, who were a step below most of the kind of opposition in the Premier League. And I just don't see the basis for Sterling to be worth that 10.0 price unless something drastically changes with the Chelsea team. That could change, right, with the transfers that could be impending. Rashford, for me, it is at a fantastic price. He's at that kind of A tier just because I think Sancho is slightly better than him pound for pound. And for me, Rashford, he is a player that has bulked up this season. He had a really terrible season last year, but 2 years back, or even 3 years back, Rashford had consecutive seasons where he was getting around 170, 180 points as an FPL player, and at a 6.5 price, you know that's a steal. So for me, it's more about how we can project Man United to do well. Do we project them to do well enough for us to get 2 players or 3 players? And if we're only going to pick one Man United attacker, are we comfortable enough in just going for Sancho? And I think the reality is that we are. I really think it is a bit of a risk to actually go for Rashford. If anything, just watching the preseason games, I would say Martial has been much more involved just from the pure goal point of view. I know Rashford has scored some goals, but most of them have been tap-ins, whereas Martial has been linking up with play, creating a lot of things, and I think he could be much more integral if, let's say, Ronaldo wasn't able to come back into the team, and Ronaldo coming back inevitably anyways would affect Rashford too. Lingard's an interesting option at Nottingham Forest. I do think it's a bit of a gamble right now. Same goes with players like Gallagher, Mahrez, Harrison, St. Maximin, Grealish, Fernandes. I just think that these are all players who have shown us glimpses in the past. I would say Gallagher specifically is a player who, in my opinion, will actually play a very pivotal role for Chelsea this season, because it does seem like he's a favourite of Tuchel's. His work rate is something that I think most managers would respect and love to have. But I think when it comes down to his goal scoring and his ability to actually find himself in the box, I don't really necessarily see Gallagher occupying those spaces. Mahrez, rotation is always still going to be a problem, no matter some of the changes. I think Julian Alvarez, for example, will take minutes away from some players. And Mahrez, we know, is a player who also is one of the more veteran players in the squad and doesn't necessarily get the most minutes, and he is kind of saved for those UCL games. Harrison is, for me, someone who could step up to be a talisman, but I still think this Leeds team is going to miss Rafinha very, very much, and I don't think he'll step up in Rafinha's place and be able to kind of deliver, in my opinion. St. Maximin is interesting because he's obviously moved into the midfield, but I think he's a player, as I mentioned previously, I think when I was talking about cheat sheets in the previous year, where I think I prefer him as a focal point when Wilson's actually out, and if Wilson's the talisman of Newcastle is actually playing consistently, I think St. Maximin gets much less of the ball, he gets much less involved, and his freedom in terms of his ability to actually hold the ball, take the ball, and actually carry the ball forwards and actually create plays is hampered slightly when there is a talisman such as Wilson up top, and I think St. Maximin just isn't really worth it for now. Newcastle's games aren't particularly good at the start too. It is front-loaded with Liverpool and City, so I just think it's a bit of an avoid. Grealish is once again a wait-and-see option. I think he is someone who could rack up a plenty amount of assists, just like he did versus, or for Haaland versus Bayern Munich last night. But that's my main concern there. Is Grealish going to score enough? And I think the answer, unfortunately, is going to be no. If he gets plenty of assists, it might make him worth that 7.0 price tag, but I think he's still a wait-and-see for me. I just think there are better options at other teams who will probably be consistently scoring a little bit more than Grealish, and that's simply what it comes down to. With Fernandes, I still think he's overpriced, kind of similar to Sterling in terms of the argument there. You have an option like Sancho, who probably could be just as effective as Fernandes. He might not be taking the penalties like Fernandes, but we know, for example, penalties have also dropped off, especially with the rule changes and also with VAR, and also referees just being less happy to award penalties that easily, and the drop-off in penalties has kind of taken away from Fernandes' ability to stack up points consistently. And I think he will play this very off-the-ball role for the team. That means he will drop deep at times and maybe not necessarily play as a centre forward. We'll see what happens, but I do think that Fernandes will have a good season, but maybe not as good a season for his kind of price and his valuation. The C tier are mostly players that I really think that we can think about. They were efficient at times in last season, but just aren't consistent enough as options. Probably the kind of second or third key players in their team, and just players I wouldn't really consider to start the season with. Maybe Barn, Ward-Prowse, and Zaha, who will be kind of key players for both Crystal Palace and Southampton respectively. But for me, what concerns me with them is ultimately the strength of schedule with Crystal Palace, and then also with Southampton. I just think they haven't made enough reinforcements to say Ward-Prowse is worth it, and that's pretty much it. So with the forwards, I'd actually say there's not too much of a discussion. There's a lot of S-tier players here, and the reason why I've done that is because I think these are the pool of players that I'd most like to start the season off with, potentially. Vardy might be someone that people will be raising eyebrows over. Same with maybe Tony and Wilson, but I do think Wilson has some tough games at the start, but is very, very well priced, in my opinion, as a player who is now playing for a Newcastle team that has continually strengthened, right, since that winter transfer window. You can now project as well for Wilson to actually benefit from some of the kind of creative forces around him with Saint-Maximin, with Fraser as well for a full season. And then with Tony, you have a really, really good start of the season. So that kind of does reflect why he's in the S tier. I do think he's someone who you would understand would be starting all the games, playing pretty much consistent minutes for Brentford. With Martial, there's much more variability here. You've got an asterisk over him with the Ronaldo situation. So for me, I would say Martial has had a fantastic preseason. And if it seems like Ronaldo is on his way out, I do think Martial immediately eclipses Tony, and maybe Tony has to falter down to the A tier. But Wilson is also at a very, very good price, as I said, for the reasons of Newcastle strengthening their squad continuously, building that defensive base as well, and then also having more creative pieces around him than in contrast to the start of the season last year, where he was already kicking on very, very well. With Haaland and Kane, I think the argument simply just comes down to whether you think Haaland will actually be able to run the gauntlet through the entire season, deal with injury concerns. We already had some injury concerns in the preseason so far. He looked really, really good in the Bayern game, but did miss the game just previous. And it seems like from Pep's interview and press conference kind of quotes that he does expect Haaland to be able to be fit by the West Ham game. So that does tell me a lot. And as I was saying with the kind of analysis of the Man City Bayern Munich game, he is going to be completely bodying and occupying the box at many times. He's someone who's very, very hungry to score goals. He's always living in the box and always looking to run off the ball. We saw some diagonal crosses kind of from Ake as well, where Haaland was very, very confident being able to run in behind defenses as well. And he's always set himself up to be there as a cutback option. He had an offside goal as well in that game. But Kane, on the other hand, has been a kind of paramount of consistency, I'd say, with exception to the start of last year. This season, though, you have a little bit more context, right? With the same manager being in charge, them ending the season so well, and him having a very, very good preseason to start with, I think Kane might be the safer pick, and perhaps even the more astute pick, just because you don't have that kind of question mark over his confidence. Not necessarily confidence, sorry, but rather his kind of injury threat, and overall, I would say as well, maybe the threat of rotation. As far as the A tier, you have players like Johnson, Nunez, and Watkins. I would say Johnson is once again another a little bit of an X factor option where I've maybe given a little bit too much credit to some of the championship teams that are promoted. We do know historically that they do tend to struggle, but sometimes the talisman within those teams, especially with here with Brennan Johnson definitely being one, it does seem like there is always going to be a scenario where those sorts of players can step up and thrive in the Premier League. We saw that with Bamford 2 years previous with Leeds, but obviously there is sometimes growing pains as well, just like we did with multiple years of Mitrovic and also even Tony at the start of last season. Nunez is a fantastic option to start. He's had a little bit of highs and lows with the preseason so far, and I think the biggest question mark, of course, is just going to be rotation. Ultimately, when Nunez is at a 9.0 price, and I see other options such as Jesus who are potentially nailed for 80 to 90 minutes a game and playing for a very, very strong team with good fixtures themselves, I think it does call into question whether I want to go for Nunez, especially when the other options in this Liverpool team are players like Robertson at a 7.0 price, and therefore it seems like it might not be warranted to actually go for Nunez, who doesn't even get those clean sheet bonus points as well that a midfielder in Liverpool would, such as Luis Diaz. With Watkins, you have a player who has a very, very good start to the season, and someone you could easily pivot out of, right, because of his 7.5 price. And I think, admittedly, maybe Watkins is someone you'd like to start the season off with over someone like Callum Wilson, and you can then pivot into Wilson later on when Newcastle have a better run of games. And that's kind of how I think the landscape is in terms of forwards. All the other options between the B and the C tier, as you can see here now with the C tier, just aren't interesting enough. And I think that's kind of the situation you have with some of these championship promoters. Even someone like Jota, in my opinion, who's now a little bit too expensive, doesn't even get those clean sheet points, and probably is the least nailed player, arguably, because of how Nunez and Diaz will contest for those starting positions. Just calls into question, I think, whether or not you want to even put much thought into your forwards. I think the simple option really is to kind of play slightly template with the forwards, go with players like Jesus or Haaland / Kane, or even an alternative at best in the A tier. Here you really have options, in my opinion, that just don't cut it. And that's pretty much what it comes down to. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Let me know your thoughts on certain players. I'm sure there's going to be some transfer dealings as well and some preseason hype that will change my expectation of players. But that's as things stand right now. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys very shortly.